The Institute.
Institute for Justice.
The National Law Firm for Liberty.
Hello, and welcome to Short Circuit. Today, we have a special Short Circuit. Instead of your usual host, John Ross, you get me, Anthony Sanders, Director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. And instead of talking about what John usually talks about, recent exciting opinions of the federal courts of appeals, we're going to be talking with a special guest. He is Charles Chuck Marohn, founder and president of Strong Towns. Chuck is not a lawyer, I'm very happy to say, one of the few guests we've had on Short Circuit who can go by that title. Instead, Chuck is a lot of other things. He is, again, the founder and president of Strong Towns. He's the author of a recent book by the same name that you all should go read and that we're going to be talking about today, amongst other things. He's a professional engineer who's licensed in Minnesota. He worked for various municipalities in the past in his capacity as an engineer, which taught him a number of things that he then put to use at his current nonprofit. He has degrees in civil engineering and urban and regional planning from the University of Minnesota. And most importantly, he lives in Brainerd, Minnesota. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Strong Towns approach to city planning, what we should be thinking about in this time of crisis, and how it intersects with the law. And we're also going to talk a little bit about licensing later in the podcast. So first, Chuck, tell us a bit about Strong Towns and what the Strong Towns approach is to our cities.
Strong Towns started with a recognition that I had that our cities were financially going broke. Even in the places that were experiencing a lot of growth that I was working with as an engineer and a planner, we were still struggling to do day-to-day things. We could build $1 million new projects, but we couldn't keep the streetlights on overnight or keep the firefighters employed or, paint crosswalks. There just was no budget for that. And as part of exploring that, came to the realization that a lot of our growth pattern, a lot of the way we build and assemble our cities creates what is really a typical cash flow trade-off. Cities get new growth. As part of new growth, they bring in a lot of revenue and a lot of cash that helps them today solve problems, make things look better, address shortfalls they have. But in exchange for that cash, they take on enormous long-term liabilities. So we get that new big box store out on the edge, lots of revenue involved in that. But as part of that, we take on a mile of new pipe and half a mile of new frontage road and drainage systems and pumps and all this other stuff as public liabilities. And when you contrast that, when you look at the tax base and the wealth that we generate and you contrast that with the long-term liability, what you see is that these projects are all cash flow negative over the long term. As soon as the maintenance cycle kicks in, cities' balance sheets go far into the negative. The way we solve that is by growing faster. We just grow more. We just try to do more projects. And so in a sense, we're like, the hamster running on the treadmill, faster and faster and faster, trying to keep up. And we just see, 70 years into this development pattern, this new kind of experiment we've been on post-World War II, our cities financially are in tatters. They're way overcommitted and they're struggling to keep up.
And so how does that compare? You said the last 70 years. So how does that compare with what used to happen before World War II?
A lot of people associate with the automobile because that's the most noticeable shift here in North America. As someone who's traveled a lot and been to different parts of the world, I will attest other countries have the automobile too. Take my word for it. But they don't build the way that we do. We do something very unique here in the United States. When we build things all at once and we build them to a finished state. If we look at human development prior to the Great Depression, what we see is that cities, human habitats, the place where we live, were always built incrementally over time on a continuum of improvement. So things would start small. They would progress incrementally, growing incrementally more intense over time. You would take a little collection of pop-up shacks and ultimately over decades and decades and decades grow them into Manhattan. That was the pattern of building. Today, if we were going to build Manhattan, we would go out and we would build Manhattan all at once with skyscrapers and what have you, and then we would walk away and be done. That's the big difference, is the way we assemble things more than anything else.
We'd have the Manhattan HOA that you didn't have to join to live in Manhattan.
It would be a ridiculous mess, is what it would be. And if you delve into that, and I think the HOA example is a really good one, because what you have before the Great Depression, and really for thousands of years of human history, is an ecosystem, a human habitat that by its very nature is designed to adapt and change and respond to stress and opportunity. What we build today, we build with purpose, something that is static, something that is designed to resist change, to not adapt. And the HOAs are a component of that. Zoning is a component of that. The way we finance things is a component of that. And so all these systems we've set up assume that we are essentially building perfection, or we're building something done, completed. And everything that comes after is designed to be non-changing, not completely static. And static systems are just fragile. They don't work over time.
And a lot of what you say about how things change over time and how they're not allowed to change over time sounds, to my ears, a lot like what we in law school talk about as the common law system, where you have a ruling on one point of law, and then another ruling comes along and it changes that a little bit. And over time you have precedent, but that precedent can change. This can be true about contract rights. It can be true about property rights, torts. How do you see that the contrast between the two, and how do you think maybe a modern understanding of law is different from how the understanding used to be, and if that's parallel in some ways to how we see neighborhoods as pop-up developments today versus they used to be, what people lived and changed over time?
That's a really deep question, because you look at common law, and one of the things that we see is that common law essentially goes hand in hand with culture. And so over time, there is, rulings. Those rulings set precedent. The precedent then shapes the culture and how we respond. And there's a back and forth. The problem, and I can't point to one, I'm sure you could, more quickly than I could, but there gets to be a problem at times when common law, in a sense, calcifies or becomes so entrenched and something new happens. The internet and copyright law as one example. If we looked at common law back to the Gutenberg age and what it meant to have a copyright protection and what have you, those things would not be able to respond very quickly to the huge changes in digital communications that we've had. And so what you see is that we have to go outside that system to try to deal with that. I think when we look at zoning and we look at the way we have established a system to, in a sense, perpetuate a replication of this development pattern, it has a lot of the same upsides and downsides. The upside of our current development approach is that we can grow very, very quickly with it. We can replicate it. There's a common culture around it. Everyone kind of understands how it works. When you're going to build the strip mall, you put in the frontage road, you put in the parking, you put a big sign out front. You
use eminent domain to get some of that property, of course.
Exactly. There's very standardized ways of doing this. What you lose, though, is you lose the capacity to adapt. And, common law adapts very slowly. Our development pattern adapts very slowly. I think the big difference between the two is that common law literally is something that has evolved, over centuries. When we look at zoning is something that appeared, had like a gestation period, and then was kind of rolled out just as a full-blown experiment all at once. And so it would be in a sense that you birthed common law, maybe had some people sitting in stasis for a couple decades chatting about it, and then just made it universal all at once. That's essentially what we did with the modern development pattern.
As many of our listeners know, we at IJ run up against zoning restrictions in some of our cases, and more in recent years. For example, we have a case in Nashville, Tennessee, about home business restrictions, where someone's just trying to have a recording studio in Nashville, in a building in the backyard, and
hard to believe. What an offensive use! Yeah,
I know. Imagine doing that and recording music in Nashville, in a building in their backyard, and. Well, we recently had a case where a woman in rural Washington state was trying to add on to her home an extra bedroom, and was told by the city that she would have to pay something like $40,000 for a lane expansion, and when just to have that extra capacity in her home. Some of these, of course, are outlandish. Some aspects of zoning people generally are more accepting of, or they maybe sound a bit more rational. Zoning has been with us for a while now. A lot of us don't like it very much, but we think at least some aspect of it is going to be here for a while longer. What do you see as the more pernicious, parts of zoning that freeze cities into place, and that particularly might be, an object that the court should take a closer look at, as in addition to policymakers taking a closer look at?
Right. It's interesting because I think zoning is a good tool for a very limited problem. The thing is, we've expanded what we expect zoning to do. I used to joke that, planners believe that with the right zoning code, you could cure cancer and solve Mideast peace. And, there's nothing a good zoning code can't accomplish for you. Of course, that's ludicrous. If you look at zoning, the Euclid, the case that established zoning at the Supreme Court, that allowed zoning locally, Euclid versus Amber, was like 1926 or something.
That's right.
It was in that, city beautiful movement, kind of let's fix cities and make them better places. Let's get the rendering plant away from the apartment complex, so, it was dealing with a lot of nuisance law. What you had, though, and I think this is the historic anomaly, is after Euclid, 3 years later, you've got the stock market crash, you've got the Great Depression, you've got World War II, and essentially the planning departments of the United States for half a generation went into hibernation mode. And what do you do when you're in hibernation mode? You're not issuing permits, you're not growing, you're not, working on the next iteration of your community. What you're doing is you're sitting there basically percolating over regulation. So what you had is like a 15, 20 years of just untested zoning theory becoming entrenched in local governments. And then when we got to the end of World War II, we just rolled it out en masse. Like, here's how we're going to recreate this brand new version of America. We're going to standardize it. We're going to, roll it out across the entire country all at once. We're going to, centralize all these different systems of building. And zoning became like a very useful tool for doing everything we wanted to do, from building, new GI Bill subsidized housing to keeping minorities out of our neighborhoods. I mean, I'm not suggesting this, but that you look at like every goal people had at the time, and they're like, well, we can write a zoning code to do that. These were things that, I think we can look back now to today and say, obviously, are in many ways like disgusting. They make us feel very queasy as to how these things were done. Yet it's a little bit like the One Ring in Tolkien's trilogy, but they were using this device for bad. We'll use it for good and get something good out of it. And I think in a way, the zoning overreach, or the idea that we can accomplish really any means we want with a good zoning code, is like the central hubris of the planning profession. And it's just wrong. It's just not correct. We have to allow our neighborhoods, if we want them to be strong, resilient, prosperous places, we have to allow them a great degree of adaptation. And zoning codes should limit themselves to only the things that, in a sense, will kill us, will destroy our neighborhoods. The idea that you would regulate like paint color and siding materials and some of the more frivolous things, but even things like setbacks and, the idea that we would become obsessed with what type of use you have in your building. Oh no, you can be a painter in this building, but not a plumber in this building. That type of thing has reached like a level of absurdity where I think it calls into question the entire system.
Right. And I mean, I've always been struck by, in reviewing zoning codes at IJ, that, sometimes the zoning code is so big, it is on a different section of the city's website because it's not like a normal ordinance. It's this massive extra ordinance that they have somewhere else and that they only review every few years because it's just such an undertaking to look into all those details you were just talking about.
I will throw some shade on the lawyers here because doing land use work. Go for it. Okay. And it's funny because doing land use work, I ran into a lot of attorneys. And it's very interesting because you could always tell right away the ones where land use law was the core of what they did and the ones where land use law was like part, they also did maybe family practice or, bankruptcy or what have you. And land use was part of it. Because the ones where land use was just a part of what they do, they would come in and they would actually try to argue the law. They would actually say, like, here's what your code says. Here's what the rule says. Here's what, the practice that this court approved or this and that. The ones where land use law was like what they did, they would never argue the law. They would always argue some bigger moral right or some, emotional thing. Because at the end of the day, the people who are practicing land use law are not judges. They're not. It's not a regular, it's a local planning board. It's like a local city council. And the things they respond to are very much more human than what a law actually is. So yeah, these zoning codes tend to be these monstrous things. And the way they're applied is not anything like what a law actually is.
Well, and that leads to a point that we at Short Circuit see a lot in reviewing all the federal courts of appeals and the ones that are reported on our newsletter and talked about on the podcast are over and over again, the federal courts will say, we are not your local zoning board. If you have something that affects you that has to do with zoning, please don't come to us because all these property owners will have some insane requirement placed upon them, like the ones we were just talking about. Say you have to have, no more than 25% of your house devoted to your at-home business, or it's something that just doesn't make any sense. They're damaged by that. They go to federal court, and the federal court says, look, it's not my problem. That's not why we have a federal constitution. Go to your local planning board. But I'm guessing when they go to a local planning board, the incentives are very, as you said, are very different. And there's not a lot of talk about the Constitution. There's talk or even state statutes, right? There's talk about, well, I know this guy and he did that and it worked for him.
There's a lot of that. And there's a lot of, quite literally, I like you, I don't like you kind of decision making. And, in some ways, and let me just say this in defense of zoning boards, I think in some ways that's kind of beautiful. I mean, there's a lot of, I think I'm a huge proponent of the bottom up kind of building of a city. I think what we've done though, is we have created a system with tremendous imbalance. In other words, let me flesh that out a little bit. When your developer's coming to the city council and they want permission to build something, a lot of times, and especially as we get into bigger and bigger cities, but even in small towns, you're talking about people who are financed through centralized mechanisms. So they're getting their money from some, insurance trust that poured money into a real estate investment trust that is out putting money into properties. They are qualifying for federal loans and through, federal systems of development designed to encourage growth. They're responding to federal infrastructure incentives that have built frontage roads and interchanges and collector streets and all this stuff to facilitate this level of growth. And so in a sense, the developer is there as like the representation and the embodiment of this kinetic growth machine that cities suffer under, A, B, neighborhoods tend to not like, especially once you're there, you develop that not in my backyard, that NIMBY attitude. Because like,
it was okay to play in my neighborhood, but not the one over there that's a farm right now.
Exactly. Like I'm good with this, but like no more of it. So it creates this like diminishing returns. The more you grow, the worse your city becomes to live in. You have all of these kind of systems, and the developer embodies all of that negativity. And so it's this whole system kind of, versus the little guy who's represented by the planning board. And I think it's the disproportion of real power at the end of the day that makes the David and the David Goliath thing act like a lunatic sometimes. I mean, and like really do like loopy, zany, non-defensible kind of things. I think a more localized development system, one that was more incremental, one with greater feedback loops, one that was more driven by opportunities on the ground, as opposed to, a federal system of growth. That type of thing, I think, would change how local zoning boards and local officials reacted to growth. So I'm not defending them because I think generally zoning boards do a terrible job. But I think understanding why is an important part of fixing that.
Mm-hmm. I said at the outset that Chuck has written a book that came out last year, Strong Towns, where he goes into detail on a lot of this stuff, and I really recommend all of you check it out. I was struck by something, I think it was in the last chapter, when you were talking about your philosophy of layers of government, that I wanted to bring up and maybe poke you a little bit about it. But I think a lot of listeners would enjoy it. So if I'm paraphrasing here, but you say that at the federal level, you're basically a libertarian, that you don't think there should be that big of a federal government, and they should stick to stuff that's more national. At the state level, you might be called a conservative, where you good fiscally responsible government that looks after the whole state is where you're at. At the municipal level, you're more of a liberal. You're okay with the government doing more stuff. And then at the neighborhood level, I think you said you're essentially a socialist. And so let the neighborhood try to plan things very locally that you're okay with. And I think most of us, especially folks at IJ, are at least glad you're not the inverse of that. Socialism at the national level and do what you want at the local level. But so if you're going to have one or the other, it sounds like that subsidiarity, it's often called, is a good idea. But I want to ask you about that, about the neighborhood level, because you brought up NIMBYism, and we've written a lot about NIMBYism at IJ, and how your neighbors can prevent you from doing something on your property because they don't want more people in the neighborhood, or they don't want you to rent out your downstairs because that would mean that more poor folk would live around there, or whatever the reason is. But what do you have to say about planning on a very local level that would just bring out these NIMBY tendencies more than just leaving it to property owners to be able to plan for their own property, incremental development in doing that, and that if there are disputes arise through nuisance or whatever, then that can be dealt with, but otherwise to let people plan on their own individual level?
It's a difficult thing. And I think, for me, the answer is I would like to see a tapestry of approaches. That construct of, libertarian to socialist as we go further, as we go closer to the neighborhood level, was really my response to this idea that, people were trying to put Strong Towns and our movement into a box. Are you a left of center? Are you right of center? Do you want big government? Do you want small government? Who are you? And the reality is we're very about trying different things from a bottom up standpoint. Communes tend to not work, and communal living tends to not work. That doesn't mean it never works. I mean, we can go to Israel today and see people living, the kibbutz lifestyle, which is very communal, and people are dedicated to that and have lived that for a long time. There's many examples throughout history of this. And so I get less offended by people in cooperation, working together at the local level to do things. And in a sense, compromising their own, if we want to just say innate, if we want to say innate American or innate constitutional rights out of agreement with each other, as opposed to,
Sure.
having it be enforced by some larger body. If I want to give up my right to associate with the woman across the street because I've voluntarily entered into an agreement with my wife to not do that, that's an okay social construct. If the government comes in and says you can't do that, I mean, that's a very different thing. And so what I have seen is as we've centralized more and more policy, and I use the backyard chicken example in the book as one to kind of illustrate this. What I've seen is more and more things that should be decided by neighbors is now being referred to city councils, regional planning boards, state commissions, and sometimes even federal courts and federal government. Can I have backyard chickens? Well, the only people that will affect is, at worst, my immediate neighbors.
Right.
And so the idea that some regional body or even some city council would decide that is not only doing a disservice to, I think, everyone who should be having this conversation, but it also robs me and my neighbors of our own agency in making those kind of decisions. And so my advice for city councils is, if in the true spirit of subsidiarity, if this is a decision that can be made at the block level, it must be made at the block level. And at the very least, at the very most, what you should be doing as a city council or as a city is offering assistance to help people reach that decision. But if two neighbors don't get along, like if they're not getting along and they can't decide this, too bad. You got to decide. Like, it's your responsibility as a neighbor, people in a neighborhood, to figure this out. I've been going to council meetings for a long, long time where I would sit there and someone would come in and complain about their neighbor. And they would demand that the city council do something about something their neighbor was doing. And the city would be like, oh my gosh, we better do that. And they would jump up and be like, let's figure this out. And the question was never raised. And if it ever was, the answer was always the same. Have you spoken to your neighbor? No, that would be uncomfortable. Like, I wouldn't want to do that. And to me, part of living as a human, part of life is that we actually have to work these things out. Because when we give it to someone else to work out for us, we're ultimately going to be disappointed with the world that is created on our behalf.
With freedom comes responsibility.
Amen. Amen. And I think we look back and we can look at human civilizations of the past who it wasn't freedom, it was survival requires us to work together. I think we have the luxury today of pinning that around freedom and the way we've constructed our government. But historically, human civilizations came together out of the need to create a stable place where we can all survive and prosper from. I hope with the way our economy is tanking that we don't wind up having that same construct again. But we're going to get closer to it than the make-believe that we've been living through.
That's right. In our remaining moments, I'd like to shift gears and we'll talk a little bit about your background as an engineer. Some of our listeners know that we've had a couple cases in recent years, including an ongoing one, about engineer licensing, particularly where people who aren't licensed professional engineers are nevertheless doing things that any normal person would call engineering. And then they receive a cease and desist letter from the Board of Engineering saying that they have to stop speaking. We had this great client I think you've read about in Oregon who now years later they are they are extending the time of yellow lights because he figured out that yellow lights aren't yellow for long enough. But in the meantime, he got a cease and desist letter from the state licensing board. You are actually licensed, and yet even you have had a run-in with the licensing board. If you'd like to talk a little bit about that and what it's taught you about occupational licensing in general.
It is crazy. The case in Oregon is nuts, and I'm really thankful that you all have intervened and helped with that, because here you have an earnest person who's trying to make things better, and it essentially comes down to the engineers being embarrassed to be shown up by someone who did the math that they should have been doing. I think the most egregious one I've seen are people serving on a bike committee, a committee established by the city to look at biking in a neighborhood. And they would make recommendations to the city on what should be done. And the engineers would come back through their licensing and say, you can't have an opinion on this and comment on it because you're not licensed to talk about transportation the way we are. This is absurd. So let me give you my case, which is equally absurd, but in a slightly different vein. So as part of the engineering license in the state of Minnesota, and this is a very common language, I am required to not do anything that would bring discredit upon the profession. So I am not to conduct myself in any way that would make the profession look bad. And often this is interpreted as I can't be a drunk. I can't be, showing up and spouting my opinions on whatever and basically being like a lout and an embarrassment to the profession. What it's often been actually interpreted as, and this is what I ran into, I had a claim made against me or a complaint against my license that my license should be taken away because I was speaking out against some of the practices that were standard within the profession, saying we need to reconsider this practice. This is a bad practice. This is a bad idea. We need to do this differently. And I was pointing out, and by the way, I'm a Minnesotan. That means that I'm kind of not really a flamethrower. I'm not like I've got some New York friends who are, loud and brash and they got a lot to say. In Minnesota, you roll your eyes and that's like a capital offense. Nothing I was doing was like really horrible beyond the pale. I certainly didn't call anyone out personally or, threaten them in any way. I was just saying like, hey, we shouldn't be building frontage roads because of this. Hey, we shouldn't be building, there's a lot of people who benefit from this system, and I think we should look at it a little bit differently. I had my license questioned by a fellow engineer who asked the board to investigate me because I was, causing disrepute on the profession, and that they should suspend my license or take my license away. And they did an investigation. Thankfully, the board found, and they notified me in writing, we found that there was nothing today that would justify taking away your license, but we're going to keep an eye on things. And potentially in the future, we might come back and have a conversation with you. So yeah, this exists in the profession. This is very common. And I've heard from other engineers in other states that have undergone similar, in a sense, threats. You better not speak up because we can take away your license. And fortunately for me, I don't practice engineering in the sense that I'm working for a city, I'm signing plans, I'm doing so, if my license were threatened, if I lost my license, it wouldn't destroy my livelihood. But this has a huge chilling effect on people within the profession who support reform and support change, but don't feel like they can speak up because their entire livelihood is threatened if they do. Absolutely. You spoke out against the guild, and the guild thought, it should use its powers to protect itself. It made me feel sad, actually, because, you go into engineering for a couple of reasons, but I think there's a couple that are universal. You become a civil engineer, a municipal, like city engineer, out building things because, first of all, you're a problem solver. That means you want to identify problems and work through them and fix them and make them better. Like you don't tolerate poor performance or bad outcomes. You're a problem solver. And then the second part of it is you generally want to do good for society. I think civil engineers look at themselves as people who improve society. So the idea that our own organizations, our own boards, our own licensing would essentially work against both of those, what I think are foundational inspirations for the average engineer, it made me very sad, and it made me really question on a deep level the whole value of licensure, actually.
Well, it sounds like we might have someone who's been a bit radicalized, and on that radical note, I think we'll call it a day. Thank you so much, Chuck, for joining us on Short Circuit. Again, Chuck's book is Strong Towns. Please check it out. Please also check out his website, where he's saying all kinds of interesting things about the end of everything right now, and that I'm sure everyone has time for. And we'll be back next week with another edition of Short Circuit about the Federal Courts of Appeals. We'll have more specials on the way in the future. And in the meantime, please stay safe and please keep listening.